Greetings everyone, my name is Jonathan Bailey. I'm from the website Plagiarism Today, which can be found at plagiarismtoday.com. I'm a copyright and plagiarism consultant and expert witness with 18 years experience in the field. I am not a lawyer. Nothing in this video is legal advice. You shouldn't be getting your legal advice from YouTube anyway. Just saying. On that note, though, if you do think my expertise can help, please do check out my consulting site at copybyte.com, copybyte.com. Find about the services I provide, plagiarism analyses, content verification, DMCA agent, and DMCA takedown services. Learn more at copybyte.com. Well, alright, this week we are talking about the current head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, or DEI, at Harvard, Sherry Ann Charleston. She has been accused of plagiarism by the newspaper, the Washington Free Beacon, and we're going to take a look at the allegations, what they mean, what are the complications and nuances involved with them, and basically try to get sort of a clearer picture of what's being accused, what likely happened, and what likely will happen as we move forward. Now, before I get too deep into this, I do want to address the elephant in the room. The Washington Free Beacon is a conservative publication. I'm not saying that on my own. I'm supporting that with NewsGuard and Media Bias Fact Check, two sources, by the way, that I think are excellent at judging the quality of news reporting and are services I keep in my browser constantly as I am surfing. That said, DEI has been a target for conservative publications, once again like the Free Beacon, and this is clearly an allegation that's motivated at least to some degree by politics. I have said in the past that I am not comfortable with this weaponization of plagiarism, and I also do believe that most of these types of plagiarism checks come in from a place of bad faith. However, that does not mean that the findings are necessarily bad. Instead, what it means is that we need to take a look at this as neutrally as possible, which is what I'm going to do in this video. Now, that said, there are two sets of allegations here. Sherry Ann Charleston, I'll be referring to her by Sherry or Sherry Charleston because for reasons we'll see in a minute it can get confusing, only really has two published works of import, her dissertation and a published paper that she was a co-author on. Both of those works are under fire now, but for very different reasons. So we're going to take a look at each work separately, and we're going to start by taking a look at the published paper, the one that she co-authored with her husband, LeVar Charleston. Okay, the first set of allegations we're going to look at involve a 2014 peer-reviewed and published paper that Sherry Charleston was an author on. The lead author on the paper was actually her husband, LeVar Charleston, and there was also a third co-author, Orlando F.L. Jackson, who apparently is a regular collaborator with LeVar Charleston. Now, this is Sherry Charleston's only peer-reviewed publication, so it's worth taking a close examination of, but this isn't really a plagiarism allegation, at least not in the traditional sense of the word. We're not talking about her taking text or ideas from other people without permission. Instead, the allegation here is that the research that was published in 2014 is nearly identical to another paper published in 2012 by LeVar Charleston by himself. Now, since LeVar Charleston is the lead or primary author on both papers, this isn't, like I said, a traditional plagiarism dispute. What this actually deals with is a pair of things that are related but not necessarily direct correlations. The first is the idea of duplicative publication. Since the two works are similar, they seem to feature the same findings, the same process, a lot of the same text, and largely the same results. That would be a case of double dipping for him. The other issue that's being at least accused or alluded to here is the concept of, well, the three Gs. Gift, ghost, or guest authorship. And that is when authorship is granted on a paper, but it isn't really deserved. There's supposed to be a certain degree of contribution, of effort, of work that is applied to whether or not one is granted authorship on a paper. In fact, one of the big debates you see in research integrity is when does a person qualify for that author slot? Sometimes they're not included as an author, sometimes they're given a special thanks at the end, other times they're given like an author slot but a way low down one, like for papers with lots of authors. And of course, you just have people who get authorship, and then you have primary and or corresponding authorship too. In this case, the allegation, to put it fairly simply, is that Sherry nor Jackson contributed adequately to this work to justify their inclusion as authors. Now, to be clear, there are times where double dipping or duplicative publication is seen as acceptable. For example, if the research needs to be presented to a different audience, maybe the journal is in a different language, maybe the journal reaches an overlapping group in the scientific field, but not one that would necessarily read the first publication. As long as both publications agree that the duplicative publication is appropriate, and typically as long as there is is some indication it is duplicative, it can be fine. It's not necessarily that duplicative publication is bad, it's just that A, it's only done under certain circumstances, and B, it's usually marked clearly as such, and this paper was not. The other issue is that LeVar Charleston is the primary author on both papers. He is the primary one. I believe he's also the corresponding author on both papers as well. That means ultimately the greatest share of the responsibility for this paper is on him. As the primary / corresponding author, he is the one that is in that lead role. He is the one who is presenting the paper. He is the one who is going to be communicating with the journals. He is the one who is responsible to make sure that the publication is following all the rules of research and academic integrity, not Sherry. Now, that said, other authors do bear some responsibility, especially if they are part of this exchange or this ploy to get guest / ghost authorship. Typically speaking, when the axe falls on something like this, it usually lands on the primary author, once again, LeVar Charleston. Having looked at this, I definitely do think this is at the very least a case of duplicative publication. The two works are very similar. I'm not an expert in the field, so I don't know for certain if the changes that were made and the new findings or the new elements were adequate to warrant the duplicative publication. I don't know. I also don't know what Sherry and or Jackson contributed to the paper to justify or warrant their authorship. These are questions that are going to have to be answered by the journal and or by other investigators at Harvard as they look into this case. But yeah, those are the big questions right now. One, was this duplicative publication authorized and justified? Two, if it was justified, why was it not clearly indicated as such in the second paper? And third, what, if anything, did Sherry and Jackson do to contribute to this and warrant their inclusion as an author on it? Those are three very thorny questions. And if it is true that basically Sherry's husband ended up republishing this paper and added them as authors so they could get an extra publication credit that they didn't deserve, that is definitely a violation of research integrity. That said, there's a lot of unknowns here for me because, like I said, I'm not an expert in the field that this paper was written in. I would tend to look more toward the actual experts in that space to determine if the contributions were adequate, both for the duplicative publication and for the inclusion of authorship. That said, the lack of any clear indication that this is duplicative does have me very wary. And yeah, I definitely think this is something that needs to be looked into deeply and we need answers on. And if it turns out to be a product of research malfeasance, it needs to be retracted pretty much immediately. That's where we sit on the research paper. Now let's shift gears and move on to the dissertation. Okay, up next, we're looking at Sherry Charleston's dissertation, which was submitted to the University of Michigan in 2009 and has been examined by both the Free Beacon, the Boston Globe, and other press outlets as well. And here, we're dealing with a more traditional, more familiar plagiarism issue. In fact, if you go back and watch my video on Claudine Gay, you go back and watch the talks I've done about Neri Oxman, you're going to find a very familiar pattern here. Basically, the accusations center around the idea that she copied text verbatim or very, very close to verbatim. And even though the sources were cited in footnotes and of course in the references section, there was no indication that the text was quoted. Like I said, if that sounds familiar, it's because it's exactly what both Claudine Gay and Neri Oxman have been accused of in a very similar vein, basically citing sources but not clearly indicating that the text was copied. And as we've talked about, when you use someone else's work, you have an obligation to indicate not just where the ideas and information came from, but any text that you use where it came from as well. There's two different types of citation there. The in-text and the footnotes and all that, that's for the idea and information. Block quotes, quotation marks, formatted tables, whatever structure you want to do, that is to indicate quoted text. And there are many, many, many sections in this dissertation, one paragraph in which 80 of 85 words were copied verbatim from the source that appear to have this issue of text that too closely imitates, mirrors, or is just straight up copied from the sources that, once again, while cited, were not cited correctly or fully. And that creates a very, very real problem because, as we've talked about elsewhere, that is definitely plagiarism. Now, does it point to an intent to deceive? Does it point to just sloppy or poor research practices / writing practices? We don't know yet. And one of the things about it is we really won't know until a much more thorough dive into this dissertation is done, even though I think the Free Beacon, the Boston Globe, and others have done some fairly significant dives into this. I also recognize that there's probably other issues to be found. I don't know what tools they used. I don't know how they conducted these checks. They weren't very clear. But basically, it's a situation where we're going to have to wait and see what else is there. Now, personally, I think what's going on with Charleston is likely more serious than what's going on with Gay, especially given that all these issues are found in one document. With Gay, yes, there were these types of poor quoting, poor paraphrasing issues, but they were spread out over a lot of documents. There was only a couple in each individual document found, and Gay had a 25-year career with lots of publication. Here we're talking about someone with 2 publications, both of which have authorship and integrity issues that have been flagged and definitely need to be investigated. So looking through the dissertation and the allegations against it, it's pretty clear that, yeah, she did not adequately cite material she quoted. She copied things in, she didn't rewrite it, which isn't how you paraphrase anyway, but she didn't put adequate effort into rewriting it, didn't indicate it was a quote, and that is indeed plagiarism. Now, as far as what corrective action there needs to be, once again, a full accounting of what actually happened in this dissertation is necessary, but that is something for both Harvard and possibly the University of Michigan to do. And that actually kind of feeds us neatly into the next section with what's likely to happen next in this case. So what is next for Sherry Charleston and her husband LeVar, and also Jackson as well? Now, one thing that I'm saying as of this recording, which by the way, it's the Friday before it goes live when I'm recording, is that neither Sherry nor her husband have commented on the allegations at all. They have remained completely silent. And to be honest, that's probably the smart thing for them to do. Simply put, there really isn't much that they can say that would improve or change the situation. As we saw with Claudine Gay, and also with Neri Oxman, sort of trying to defend yourself and coming up with these awkward platitudes or euphemisms for plagiarism doesn't seem to work and only seems to fan the flame. So staying quiet is probably a smart move. Now, a formal complaint has been filed at Harvard, so it's very, very likely, in fact, almost certainty, that they will be investigating these allegations. Now, the Claudine Gay investigation did not make me particularly happy, to be honest with you. While they definitely did more than I thought when I was talking about it in the first videos and the first articles, they still bungled the investigation in a couple of ways. One, they brought in this independent panel, but only had them look at the initial set of allegations, which was kind of a weird thing, and then they turned to their own internal panel to do the investigation of the rest of Claudine Gay's work, and that panel, for reasons completely unclear to me, did not look at her dissertation, which is failing pattern recognition in my mind, because basically, if you look at what's been going on in Romania, Germany, now Norway, and other countries, the dissertation is usually the first thing to be examined when someone wants to look into the credentials of a politically divisive figure. So, yeah, the dissertation absolutely should have been checked as part of that. I recognize that they didn't want to cover things from when she was a student and only wanted to target when she was employed at Harvard, but that's just failing basic pattern recognition to me. So they really didn't do an incredibly good job of the case, even if they did a better one than I thought. That said, this case is different. Like I said, there's 2 documents, 1 and 2. And that is pretty much all of Sherry Charleston's research output. That's pretty much everything to my understanding. She has 1 peer-reviewed work and she has her dissertation. So it should be very easy to do these checks and find out what's going on. We're not going through this huge body of work like we were doing with the Claudine Gay case. That said, the real question is, what is the University of Michigan going to do here? Will they investigate? As I said in the What's Next video, it's not likely. Universities do not spend a lot of time investigating claims of plagiarism involving students that have already been graduated. They'll obviously spend a great deal of time with students that are still there, but once one has their degree in hand, the odds of a university putting forth the effort, the resources, the time, the money, the headache to launch any kind of serious investigation is slim. So I kind of think that as far as her degree goes, she's in the same place as Neri Oxman, who of course had her dissertation at MIT questioned, I don't think there's going to be a serious investigation, and if there is any kind of an investigation or hearing, it's going to lead more toward trying to work out a solution where she can keep her degree but correct the paper in some way, just because that's what universities do in order to avoid the long process and in order to avoid the possibility of litigation. In short, it's going to be interesting to see what Harvard does here and what their investigation turns up. It'll also be interesting to see if Sherry Charleston chooses to resign, like Claudine Gay did. If Sherry Charleston chooses to resign, she'd probably be leaving the school entirely, where Claudine Gay just went back to being a member of the faculty. So we will have to see what happens with this, but I do believe Harvard's going to conduct an investigation, and hopefully a more complete and successful one than they did with Claudine Gay. And the University of Michigan probably won't do anything. That is, if this case follows the pattern of all the ones I've seen going by. Well, that's all for this week. Thank you for watching this video to the end. You're an actual trooper. Still working on improving this channel, improving the quality and the usefulness of these videos. Please do check out the full article on particular allegations at plagiarism.com. I have a link to the original article in the description. I also have a link to the Free Beacons article, as well as the Boston Globe and a couple of other places that have been talking about it. Also, just to remind you, feel free to check out my consulting site at copybyte.com, copybyte.com. That's where I talk about all the services I provide, and you can hit me up and see how I can help. In the meantime, thank you again. Like and subscribe. I've remembered it this time, and I will see you all next week.